Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and you're listening to Diplomatic Immunity from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. Welcome to the second episode of our seventh season of Diplomatic Immunity, where we'll be taking a look at the role of foreign policy in the upcoming 2024 presidential election. As we approach voting day on November 5th, we'll be taking you through the key things to know about where the candidates stand on international issues, how a win for either might affect U.S. diplomatic strategy, and how the rest of the world is watching with bated breath. We talked to Emma Ashford, Senior Fellow with the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy Program at the Stimson Center, about what the Democratic and Republican standard bearers have said so far on the campaign trail about key issues like the war in Ukraine, strategic competition with China, and war in the Middle East. We delve into these issues and more, as well as how Trump and Harris approached international issues during their respective 4 years in office. Welcome to Diplomatic Immunity.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Emma Ashford. Emma is a senior fellow with the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy Program at the Stimson Center, where she works on a variety of issues related to the future of U.S. foreign policy, international security, and the politics of global energy markets. Her first book, Oil, the State, and War, The Foreign Policies of Petrostates, was published by Georgetown University Press in 2022 and explored the international security ramifications of oil production and export in states such as Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Venezuela. Dr. Ashford also writes a bi-weekly column, It's Debatable, for Foreign Policy magazine, and her long-form writing has been featured in publications such as Foreign Affairs, the Texas National Security Review, Strategic Studies Quarterly, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the National Interest, and War on the Rocks, among others. Find links to her recent work in our show notes. Let's listen in on the conversation. I'm excited to be joined by Emma Ashford this week, and longtime listeners of our podcast will remember Emma joined us a few years ago to talk about some grand strategy stuff in China and all that kind of stuff. But we have her back this week to talk about the election and the viewpoints on foreign policy of the respective candidates. Emma, thanks for joining us.
It's great to be here.
All right, so I'm just going to jump right into it here. I think at this point, everybody understands that Kamala Harris is running against Donald Trump. And some of this obviously will be known to some folks because, Trump was president already and Harris has been part of an administration so far. But that doesn't mean that there's not differences and things we need to know and get caught up on the foreign policy side of things. So, Harris is relatively a newcomer on the Democratic side, and vice presidents historically don't really play a major role in foreign policy when they're sitting vice presidents. But can you sort of talk a little bit about what are or what have been Harris's foreign policy positions in the past and on the campaign trail to this point?
Yeah, so thanks for having me today. I think perhaps the most interesting thing about both Trump and Harris is that they are what you might call quasi incumbents. We have some evidence of what their foreign policy might be based on their time in office, but for different reasons, as we can talk about, that's not necessarily going to tell us exactly what they might do while in office. So when it comes to Harris, it's partly because as her time in the Senate was not particularly focused on foreign policy. She was previously in domestic policy jobs in California. And then, of course, she's been inside the Biden administration where she basically does the foreign policy of the administration, even if it's not hers. It's fairly hard to get an actual read on what her foreign policy views are, if indeed she has strong or committed foreign policy views. A month or two back when she became the candidate, I might have said, well, she may have different views than Biden and she's done a fairly good job at hiding them and fitting in the administration. There were a few signs that she'd supported progressive bills while she was in Congress, things like that. I think it's increasingly looking like she may just not have firm views on foreign policy and may be willing to, do whatever she thinks is electorally perhaps the best strategy.
Is there a potential for a quite different policy from Biden if she gets elected? Because, you're hewing sort of to the electorate, right, in a general election and like doing and saying the things that you think are going to get you elected to a certain extent, right? You're not going to necessarily go too crazy on one way or the other. But, I guess it does leave the room open for more daylight between her and the current Biden administration.
Absolutely. I mean, I think she has greater freedom of action than many other presidential candidates in recent history have had. And partly she didn't have to go through a contested primary, right? She didn't get asked tough questions. She retains a lot of ability to change her approach to foreign policy. That said, if anything, I think she has in some ways doubled down on Biden's rhetoric and perhaps gone even more hawkish, has embraced folks like Liz Cheney and Dick Cheney, her father, has sort of been very vocal about things like support for Ukraine. She's been extremely vocal and hawkish on Iran, which is actually quite surprising from a Democratic candidate. So I think it's possible that, even if she does change course, it may not necessarily be in a more dovish direction.
Interesting. Yeah. And, so flipping to the other side, there's obviously the Republican nominee has been president before, has had some, fairly stark and well talked about positions on foreign policy compared to other Republican presidents and nominees in the past. But, can you give us another sort of a reminder of, the big outlook from Trump and his followers in his Republican Party today? And, has it differed, or do you see it as changed at all from when he was last president?
So, Trump's first term is kind of an interesting example of what happens when you get advisors and a president who are not necessarily on the same page in foreign policy. And that was one of the reasons, one of the many reasons for the churn in personnel we saw during the Trump administration was that he had advisors, folks like Rex Tillerson or Jim Mattis, who didn't always agree with him and who actually tried to persuade him to move in, a different direction in foreign policy. I think that is less likely to happen this time around. A lot of folks are saying this, and I think it's true. So we're likely to see a policy that I think hews a little more towards what Trump himself actually thinks in the very broadest strokes. A much more unilateralist Jacksonian foreign policy, hawkish on China, hawkish on Iran, but potentially not as supportive of Ukraine, potentially pulling back from NATO, caring a lot about whether allies are free riding. All of those things, I think, are potentially at play here. And, again, I think the selection of advisors will be key, but it's also worth noting he selected JD Vance to be his vice president, who, again, more in line on foreign policy with Trump than basically any other candidate in that pool.
Can you define Jacksonian foreign policy for us?
So, the historian Walter Russell Mead wrote a book a number of years ago about US foreign policy, in which he basically argued that there are kind of four different types of US foreign policy, and he named each of them after a US president, right? So, there's Hamiltonians, Madisonians, Jeffersonians, Jacksonians. And the opinions he ascribes to these groups tie up very loosely with those early presidents. The one that really matters, I think, for today is this notion of Jacksonian. Andrew Jackson, as president, very supportive of tariffs, very supportive of punitive American military action whenever America was threatened. And I think people have been using this word to describe Trump since his first term. I think it really fits very well in its broad strokes. The idea that America, doesn't necessarily want to be involved militarily all around the world, but doesn't hesitate to use force if actually threatened. The idea that America is happy to engage with the world, but the terms of trade have to be exceedingly favorable to the US, for example. And so you can contrast that with, again, those other visions if you want to talk about them more. But I think it really does fit pretty well for Trump, who has shown effectively a willingness to use American coercive power, military power, financial power to achieve US ends without necessarily worrying about US allies or global opinion or any of those sort of soft power things.
Yeah, I think you're spot on the differences within the administration this time around. I think are going to be key to, what policy actions he actually can do and will do if he wins re-election this time around. The lack of sort of the quote, adults in the room that we talked about during the last Trump administration. So moving forward, when we look at the two candidates, I'm first going to ask you about differences and then we'll get to similarities. But on some of the key issues out there right now, Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, immigration, NATO, things like that. Like what do you see as the major points of difference between the two?
So I think Ukraine is obviously the most visible difference, and perhaps we could extend that to European security more broadly. Harris has really leaned in on the Biden administration's rhetoric on NATO, for example. We had that visit a week or so back from Zelensky that was practically a campaign stop for Harris. And Trump, while I don't think he's necessarily as negative on Ukraine as some people say, I don't think he's going to immediately pull support for Ukraine and sign a peace deal with Russia. I do think he's much more likely to start pushing pressure on both Kiev and Moscow to actually come to some kind of an arrangement there. So I think that is almost certainly the biggest point of difference between the two sides. On Israel and Gaza, I think a very open question about whether there'll be differences at all. Again, one might have expected, given the electoral implications, particularly up in Michigan, you might have expected Harris to, at the very least, push back a little on some of the humanitarian problems in the Israeli campaign in Gaza and now in Lebanon. We've not really seen that. So we might actually find ourselves in a situation where there's very little daylight between Trump and Harris on Israel.
Yeah, and I think that's been a little surprising because of her, more progressive background to some extent, but also, as you mentioned, the electoral implications in places like Michigan. I think a lot of people thought that she might have pushed a little bit further on that during the election. Moving on to similarities, there's places like China that I think American politicians across the board are just kind of hawkish on these days. Places like immigration, where obviously, Trump has been very hard on immigration since he first came down the escalator in 2015 and announced his candidacy. But the Biden administration and Harris have moved, to a more hard line on that as well recently. So, we talk a lot about the differences, but and you also mentioned that Harris might be a little bit more hawkish on Iran than we had expected. So, where do you see similarities in their potential policies?
I mean, there are a number of places I think where we are going to see similarities, and you've named some of them already. I think that China is by far the most obvious one, and some of this is just that there is a hawkish consensus on China. But I think also if you sort of get down into the weeds and you start talking about things like trade policy, or how the administration might think about tariffs, whichever Trump or Harris administration it is, you see a lot of similarities in some of the policies that are being proposed. Now that the Trump version of this sounds very tough and unilateral, and it's about punishing China, and the Harris version probably talks more about allies and partnerships and pushing back on China, but it's fundamentally the same policy. And I imagine that we'll see continuity in policy and potentially even some continuity in personnel between a Biden administration and whichever administration comes next.
So, we talked about the potential of folks that could be brought into the administration from the Trump side, but also looking at the potential second Trump administration and the sort of the broader bureaucracy and our experience the last time around of him sort of hewing more towards listening to military voices and what they tried to do at the State Department and things like that, and what has been talked about with Project 2025 as far as bureaucracy goes and everything like that. What do you potentially foresee a second Trump administration meaning for a place like the State Department and sort of the foreign policy bureaucracy writ large?
That's a really interesting question. And I think to answer it, we also have to take a step back and talk about what's going on in the Republican Party when it comes to foreign policy. Trump's first term really did help to break the stranglehold that neoconservatism had on Republican foreign policy elites and elites more generally. That's not to say that viewpoint is not still out there. It absolutely is. But particularly if you look generationally, if you look at younger conservatives, what you find is, again, a much more Jacksonian, much more realist approach to the world, and one that's far less like George W. Bush. It's less about spreading democracy. It's less about intervening everywhere for US values. But that's a generational shift. And there are a lot of folks still around who came up in the George W. Bush administration, who are neoconservative by inclination, and who are still pushing for positions in, a second Trump White House. And so those divisions in foreign policy, I think, personnel is really going to determine a lot of what we see over the next 4 years if it is a Trump presidency. And the reason I mention all of this when you ask about the State Department is because I think this is another one of those interesting divisions. You might think that the neoconservatives would be more pro funding of the State Department, that they'd want to talk to other countries and allies, etc. That's actually not the case for many of them. They're much more interested in just military power. And instead, what we've heard is folks like Elbridge Colby, who was a Trump appointee in the first term. We've even heard folks like J.D. Vance talk about the importance of the State Department as one tool of US foreign policy. So that more realist side, I think, still very hawkish, etc., but open to considering, diplomacy as an actual tool of US foreign policy. And so again, I think a lot of these internal Republican disagreements could shape how we see outcomes in different agencies and in different policy areas.
That's interesting because I think, a lot of people look at the Project 2025 and sort of the gutting of the civil service and putting in of more Trump aligned people into office lends itself to thinking that it would be a diminution of the State Department, but that might not necessarily be the case. If they're still looking at diplomacy, it would just be diplomacy that is full Trump diplomacy.
And the first time around, the Trump administration was very focused on the State Department as, the main vehicle for pushing US arms sales, for example, right? So think about it again, diplomacy with a Trumpian flavor, right? Appointees, ambassador appointees, right? This is a thing in every administration, is that state is overwhelmed by political appointees who have more to do with being donors to an administration than they do with actual diplomacy. That trend would just continue in a Trump administration. It would just be, Trump preferences that actually drive it. So, I think it's certainly true that some of the civil service reforms that are being proposed could negatively impact state or DoD or any other national security agency the way they do others. But I don't think it's particularly detrimental for diplomacy, and particularly given, again, how many appointees the state already has to deal with in that context, it might be less problematic.
So you mentioned that Vice President Harris has a smaller record in the Senate and didn't necessarily focus on foreign affairs, although she has been vice president for 4 years and has sat in the Situation Room and done things like that. Do you think that there is a benefit, even with the potential for sort of chaos of a Trump administration, a second Trump administration, that experience would be beneficial, moving forward with another Trump administration?
Look, I'm not convinced that Donald Trump learned significant lessons from his first term in office, other than perhaps to surround himself with people that agree with him rather than disagree with him. When it comes to Harris's experience in foreign policy, again, she's in this interesting situation because of the fact that Joe Biden only dropped out at the last minute and because he's eligible for a second term. When she was brought into the ticket in 2020, it was to shore up their left flank. It was to bring a woman, a minority, onto the ticket who had good progressive bona fides. She didn't bring any foreign policy experience and wasn't expected to. Biden was a very strong foreign policy contender. And during the first 4 years, she's actually had fairly minimal involvement in foreign policy. They gave her Latin America as her area for foreign policy, but mostly tied to the border. A bit of a poison pill there, quite frankly, for her. She's given a few speeches in high profile venues, most notably the Munich Security Conference. We can't glean much from those because they would have been written by the White House rather than her staff. So, to be frank, it's not clear that Harris has been exposed that much to the machinery of foreign policy. If Biden had had a second term, if she had continued as VP and intended on running for president after that, there would probably have been a period of a couple of years where they would have tried to get her more experience, put her out there on foreign policy issues, find something to work on. None of that happened. So I think, again, I said this at the start, but with Harris, I'm not convinced she has strong views. And I think that means that the role of advisors will be really important. We know this from literature, that that's how this often works. And that's, I think, why so much of the media attention recently is focused in on Harris's key advisors and what role they might play in an administration.
Speaking of that, do you have any sort of thoughts or inkling on who might be some key foreign policy advisors in either one of the potential administrations and what we might be able to glean from that as far as foreign policy strategies and policies go?
Most of the focus has been on Phil Gordon, who is currently Harris's national security advisor, and to a lesser extent on Rebecca Lissner, who's his deputy. Now, both are mainstream Democratic foreign policy hands. I would say the main thing that's notable is that I think in both cases, they are of a strain of Democratic foreign policy thinking that has been critical of things like the war on terror. So, they're perhaps a little closer to the Obama administration thinking on some of this than the Biden team. That said, again, Harris has not had a strong background in foreign policy, has not had a lot of interaction with folks in this space. And so, I mean, I think while it's pretty obvious at this point that the top ranks of Biden's advisors on foreign policy will probably go, right? I don't think, Anthony Blinken's not going to stay on at state. Jake Sullivan's probably not going to stay on at the National Security Council. But it wouldn't surprise me if at the middle and lower appointee levels, if there was significant continuity in a second Harris administration from who is in the Biden administration right now.
So, that being said, as far as sort of the top tier positions go, do you think because of her lack of foreign policy experience, do you think that lends itself more to her sort of maybe potentially bringing in a bigger outside name as like Secretary of State or something, that somebody that's more experienced or has thought about these things more potentially or not?
I think the most obvious contender for Secretary of State in a Harris administration is actually Bill Burns. He has been doing the job. Bill Burns is currently director of the CIA, for those who don't know, but he has actually been doing the job on an informal basis for most of the last 2 to 3 years. Whenever difficult negotiations need to be carried on with US adversaries or with countries that aren't necessarily close allies, it is Burns that goes and does the job, not Tony Blinken. And so Blinken's position as Secretary of State, I think, owes as much to his long working relationship with Biden as anything else. So Burns would probably be the logical candidate to both provide some continuity and also some change. Outside of that, again, I think it's very open. What we will probably see again, if Harris herself does not have strong views and her staff are not really trying to put a stamp on this, it will probably be much more about internal Democratic coalitional discussions than anything else.
Well, I know Burns would have a lot of fans inside the State Department if he was selected as Secretary of State. What about, you mentioned Elbridge Colby on the Trump side. Any other names that are coming up?
So there's a variety of folks that are close to the former president. Keith Kellogg is a name that we often hear mooted about as a potential national security advisor. Robert O'Brien, who performed the role at the end of the last Trump term, who's still quite close to the former president. And then there are some, wild cards, folks like Michael Anton, who have, you know, typically focused a little more perhaps on domestic policy or at least on immigration policy, but who have foreign policy interests. So I think there's probably on the Republican side, that field is just a lot more open in terms of, who could be decided on, in a transition process to come into the administration.
So I'll get you out of here on this question. On our last episode, we talked to Elizabeth Saunders specifically about foreign policy and elections and whether they matter or not and all that kind of stuff. She tended to think that they don't really matter that much to the voter and normally and historically. What are your thoughts? Do you think that over the past 4 years, with issues like Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, the Afghanistan withdrawal, the vast sort of bigger strategic viewpoints of the two candidates, do you think going into this election that it will matter, or do you think it still kind of falls back to bread and butter issues of the economy and immigration and things like that?
Yeah, and I do think it's funny that we talked at the start of this episode about immigration as being a foreign policy issue, but now we're separating it out. I think there's a good reason to do that when we're talking about polls, because the polling pretty much uniformly reveals that foreign policy is low salience for voters. It doesn't matter that much. And immigration is basically the top issue when you ask people what they care about. I would say that foreign policy it's not what most people vote on. It really isn't. But it can matter at the margins. And I'll give you one example from 2016, where there's been some interesting academic work, political science and economics, on the marginal votes in states like Ohio that helped to swing the presidency towards Trump and away from Hillary Clinton, that suggest that actually the toll of the war on terror, particularly excess deaths, in certain communities, and the fact that Trump spoke out against the war may have been part of what helped swing Ohio towards him. So these things can matter at the margins. And if I were to sort of focus in on one message that I think has been playing well for Republicans this year, it's the Ukraine question. Ukraine aid is increasingly unpopular, right? We've got two-thirds of the electorate saying at this point that the US should do about the same or less for Ukraine as it has been. We have a number of polls suggesting that a vast majority of the US at this point wants to push for a peace settlement. And so I think the Trump Vance campaign has been fairly effective in, using this in messaging as, Harris wants to send your money to Ukraine and not use it here at home. I mean, again, that's dirty politics, but it's also really fairly powerful messaging. And so at the margins, this is part of why Zelensky's stop in Pennsylvania, perhaps the key swing state, was so controversial. At the margins, that kind of thing can matter. So I don't write off foreign policy entirely, even though it's certainly not what most people base their vote on.
Yeah, and in an election like this, where it will come down to literally just a handful of thousands in a few key states, the margins definitely matter. We will see. Maybe we'll have you back on in the new year after January 20th to talk about the elected and inaugurated president and what their sort of initial foreign policy views and strategies have looked like. So, Emma, thanks so much for joining us.
Yep, it'll be interesting either way.
Yep, yes, that it will. So, all right, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Emma Ashford for her time and thoughts. And thank you for listening to this episode of Diplomatic Community. This show is produced by Freddie Melanson and Jarrett Dang. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GU Diplomacy, and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.